Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this webinar on the use of identifiers in DDEX messages. We will be talking about 4 items today, or 4 issues today. I'd like to give you a small brief introduction into DDEX. I'd like to introduce you to 8 fundamental aspects about identifiers that I think are worth remembering whenever we're talking about identifiers before talking about the main identifiers that are used within DDEX messages. DDEX itself doesn't identify or doesn't produce identifiers, doesn't have an identification system with one small exception, but clearly we work with industry identifiers quite extensively, and it's worth just going through those identifiers. I'm not going to go into too much detail of those identifiers because then we could spend all day long on those, and that's just not feasible. And last but not least, there are some message internal identifiers that are being used as part of the structure of those messages, and it is certainly worth talking about those and listing those. If you have questions, please do ask. We have the chat facility. That's the easiest way to do that. And if you then ask a question, I'm reading the chat, so I will be able to answer any questions if any come up. Don't wait for the end, just ask right away. Now, DDEX is a standards setting organization. We're developing message formats, message choreography, message protocols. The format, clearly, that's the structure, how the messages look like. Identifiers are part of the format, but it's not enough to just have a decent format of communicating the stuff that you need to communicate, but you also need to know when to send it to whom, what are the triggers, what is the hence and forth between different companies, those are the choreographies, and you need to know how those bits and bytes are being shared from one party to another. That is the protocol bit. Those are the things that DDEX does with a view of efficiently or making the supply chain, the value chain, more efficient, saving us all money, giving us all more funds and more resources to actually progress the business, progress the music industry. So our mission really is to develop standard message formats, including the choreographies around specific business transactions. There is no generic choreography here. Every single business transaction has its own little choreography, has its little own standard. And then you have the communication protocols that sit on top of that or underpin all of that. We also then work with standards organizations, with other standards organizations to improve identification of those core entities that we'll be talking a little bit more about today. Whether that's musical works, sound recordings, whether that's locations, whether that's people and parties, those things are all essential for efficient value chain communication along the value chain. And therefore, we need to make sure that those identifiers work appropriately with our standards, within our standards, and work appropriately, full stop, generally speaking. If there are no identification systems, we start developing one. And there's one I'll briefly touch base on a little bit later where this is about to happen. Overall, all of this is intended to improve metadata quality, metadata consistency, and make the supply chain more efficient, as I said. This diagram, everybody will have seen, I hope so far, that's all the different messaging standards that we have developed so far. I don't really need to go into any more details. There are plenty of webinars on our website to talk about basically each of those colored lines, if you're interested. Important though, and maybe the DDEX's biggest achievement so far is the DDEX Data Dictionary, which provides what we sometimes call the lingua franca for the music industry. It allows two different companies' computer systems to communicate and translate one company's terminology into the music industry terminology, and then on the other side, again, back into another company's internal language. Because let's face it, everybody has their own way of expressing things, but we need to have one common way of expressing things, having common semantics, having common structures that allows us to communicate efficiently with one another. And last but not least, DDEX is pretty ubiquitous. The last time I've checked, we had more than 5,500 implementation licenses that have been issued. That doesn't mean that there are 5,500 companies that are using DDEX as we speak. Some companies, let's face it, have disappeared since they have taken out an implementation license. But it does mean that there isn't really any serious music company that isn't using DDEX in one way, shape, or another. We do not have any specific information on implementations because that's not DDEX's role. We just develop those standards to the best of our ability so that companies can use it, and then that's the end of that, if you like. So let's talk about identifiers and basics, and let's talk about 8 different concepts that need to be looked at. Some of them sound esoteric, sound over the top when you're looking at them from a perspective of somebody who just has an item and needs to be able to identify that and share that identifier with their business partners. But I think it is worth going through these and to think about what it actually means to do those things that we need to do with identifiers. And those concepts are important enough to be called out. The biggest one is what is typically called functional granularity. And it starts right out with a very odd one, because it says that something needs to be identified if it needs to be identified, which sounds and which is circular. But that is actually the crux of the issue. If there is a need for identifying something, or for having a short handle to point to a specific entity, whatever that entity may be, then it ought to be identified. That means that someone then needs to allocate an identifier. And it's important that it's not just that company that allocates the identifier that needs to decide whether it needs identifying, but their business partners as well. For example, does a musical work need identifying? For a record company, they may not think so, but they send out information about musical work to their business partners. They do need to have works identified. Therefore, wouldn't it be better if there is a work identifier already allocated at the record company, or that the record company knows of an identifier for that musical work when they send out the information? And yes, of course, there is such an identifier. So it should be possible to identify an entity whenever it needs to be distinguished or whenever it needs to be identified. And the same applies to your business partners. If your business partner needs to separate 2 different entities that you control, you better identify it for their benefit and in the long run for your own benefit as well. But what are those entities that need identifying? And there are 4 core concepts that come up again and again and again, and those are abstraction, expression, performance, and manifestation. Abstraction, that is in our world, the musical work, the composition and the lyrics. Somebody has thought them up and has therefore created a musical work. That can then be performed. You can sing that song and you can then record that song. You can make a manifestation of it. And all of those things may need identification on their own. To express that slightly differently, manifestations are expressions of abstractions created through performances. So you perform a musical work, an abstraction, that's an expression of that musical work in this case, and then you may record it, and that is then a manifestation. Sometimes also called a fixation. This diagram was created in 2000, June 2000, or before June 2000, and is actually kind of the core identifier that everybody who deals with identifiers, who creates identification systems, regularly looks at. So you have at the bottom right the abstraction, the thing that somebody conceives, which is then expressed in an expression, typically a performance in our world, and it's a bidirectional link, so you can express an abstraction and you can abstract an expression, which is then sometimes, if it's in a recording studio, then it will be fixated or fixed into a manifestation. Sound recordings are then those manifestations, or those are the things that end up on the tape or the virtual tape these days. But that also then talks about one other core entity, or one core differentiation. You have classes versus instances. The music industry really only cares about class identifiers. So there's an example about a book on this screen. That book with that ISBN number is a class identifier. It does not identify the book that's actually on the shelf, potentially behind me. If I numbered all of those, that would be an instance identifier. We don't care about instances. We care about those classes. One side note here, you see that the ISBN has dashes in it. Same is typically the case for ISRCs and ISWCs as well. These dashes are only for readability purposes, only when being presented for human consumption. Within all of our DDEX messages, those dashes should not be included. So an ISRC is just a sequence of characters, no dashes when being communicated in a DDEX message, because DDEX messages are for computer-to-computer communication, not for human consumption. Whenever there's an identifier, there has to be what is typically called reference descriptive metadata. That's the piece of information, the pieces of data that can be used to differentiate two items from one another. So if two items have the same reference descriptive metadata, they are the same entity. And if people have the same, or if people have the same identifier, then their reference descriptive metadata has to be the same. Same applies to sound recordings. And each identification system then has its own rules of when there is actually a difference, when there needs to be difference. Those are typically called functional granularity rules, which basically says that, for example, in a sound recording, if there's human input, when you're creating one sound recording from another sound recording, then the ISRC needs to change. If there is no such human input, if it's just a normalization, an equalization, or a compression, at that stage, there is no need to create a new identifier. Actually, the standard specifically says that you shall not create a new identifier for those instances. Having reference descriptive metadata is clearly important for every issue, because otherwise you cannot, nobody knows whether two items are the same or not, or why they are different. And that also means that people need to have access to the reference descriptive metadata. Those who require access to the metadata should get access to the reference descriptive metadata. Within the confines of privacy, confidentiality, contract rules, and all of those things, of course, they still apply and they should always apply. But in principle, if somebody needs to be able to differentiate two entities, they need to be able to tell why they are different, and that needs the reference descriptive metadata. And as I already said, identifiers and metadata have to be current, otherwise they're worthless. In the music industry, that specifically relates to rights and ownership information. Rights and ownership information is typically not part of the reference descriptive metadata, but it's still essential metadata for many of the business transactions that we're dealing with. Therefore, it needs to be current, and it needs to be reliable. And the reliability is, so shows experience, best attributed by saying who says. If you know who created a specific piece of metadata, who created a specific identifier, or on whose behalf was a specific identifier allocated, you then can derive whether you can trust that information. Do you know it's, if we're talking about a musical work and that identifier was allocated by an owner of a musical work, then that is most likely or more likely to be reliable than it was if the identifier was allocated by a third party, for example. Not a guarantee, but at least it's a hint. Identifiers need to be persistent, which means that they need to be in existence for longer, or at least as long as the entity it identifies. There is a good point for temporary identifiers, and there is one exception, those pointers within DDEX message. I'll talk about that a little bit longer in a minute. Those are clearly also valid, but typically identifiers, they need to be persistent. And the identifier only changes if the item changes. I talked about the sound recording being compressed or something like that. That doesn't mean that a new identifier should be allocated, because that's other rules of functional granularity that the ISRC standard in this case defines as when something should get a new identifier. One thing that many people get very hung up sometimes is whether an identifier is a private identifier or a public identifier. And there seem to be different views, as I've just said, whether that's necessary. You clearly have public open identifiers like ISRC, like ISWC, for example. They're shared by the allocating organization with its business partners, and they are defined through an open process, either by ISO or through a consortium and the like. But there's also good reason to have bilateral identifiers, things like the Apple ID, for example, that are used on sound recordings by Apple. Now, that's an identifier. It's shared with their business partners, but it's an identifier where the identification criteria, those rules of granularity, they are not necessarily public knowledge. And Apple can change those whenever they want. But still, it's a fairly useful identifier. And then there are private and proprietary identifiers, which are also worthwhile having. We all have them in our internal databases, and I'll touch base on that in a little as well. And last but not least, resolution is a core issue that needs to be talked about. And it's not just resolution, it's also the inverse, which is queries. Query is when you have the metadata and you want to find the identifier. But more importantly, arguably, is the concept of resolution, where you have an identifier and you want to get the reference descriptive metadata, or you may want to go from one identifier to another identifier because you know that you have an identifier, global identifier, and then there is an identifier for a specific vertical that you may want to go, that you want to bridge over. You may want to get actually the item that is being identified, so from an ISRC to an MP3 file, for example, or from an identifier to a website where the item can be accessed or purchased, or those kind of things. Those kind of mechanisms are quite essential for an identification system to work properly. So what are the entities that could be identified? And I'm not saying that all of these need to be identified using an identifier. And mind you, everything can be identified by just stringing all the reference descriptive metadata that when you think about an item, when you string that all together, you get a very long, very cumbersome, unique identifier. We have musical works, we have all kinds of recordings, whether that's finished sound recordings as well as candidate mixes, stems and the likes. We have collection of primary resources and primary and secondary resources, things that DDEX typically calls a release. You have products, whether they're priced, whether they're not priced, whether they are dealing with territorial information that will be available in the US, this will be available in China, this will be available in Canada. You may even have a need to identify a specific sound recording if it has been used in a specific context. Sales reporting is quite often important that you know this sound recording was used in Canada at 8:06 in the evening based on a streaming service, whatever the context may be. Does that need identifying? Does that need identifying with an identifier? And the last bit on this slide then are combinations of the above. So all of these things can be identified, but not all of these need identifying. Again, you need to ask yourself those three critical questions. Do I need to identify an entity? Is that important to me? If it is, yeah, let's develop a system that provides functional granularity. That is, when do I need to allocate a new identifier, or when are two things actually the same thing from that identifier's perspective? If I don't need it, then I need to ask myself whether someone else needs that to be identified with those rules. And if that question is yes, well, then again, I need to think, or most likely we together need to think about those rules of granularity, and then we can create the identifier for those entities. And last but not least, even if there is a need to identify things, does it actually need an identifier? Or is identification by metadata or an identification by a combination of identifiers sufficient? There is no general answer to this question. That depends very much on an item by item or question by question basis. So what are the identifiers used throughout DDEX? And it's not surprisingly large set, because there are different types of entities that we're dealing with: musical works, sound recordings, releases, and parties, and potentially others. And for each of those are different identifiers. So for musical works, we have the ISWC, the International Standard Work Code, but there are also things like Opus numbers and composer catalog numbers. And last but not least, you have proprietary IDs. Each of those are potential important ways of identifying a musical work. I'll come back to those in a bit. For sound recordings, it's typically an ISRC or a catalog number or proprietary IDs. When it comes to releases, it's the global release identifier. It's an IFPI standard that has been developed by IFPI, is now kind of owned by DDEX. You then have ICPNs or barcodes, and you have catalog numbers or proprietary IDs. And lastly, you have parties. With parties, I mean bands, orchestras, individual musicians, writers, companies like record companies, publishers, and so forth. And they can be identified by an ISNI, again, one of those ISO standards, by a DDEX party ID. And especially for parties, there are a number of identification systems in different verticals, if you like. The IPA number and the CSAC Society ID are numbers that are used in the music publishing space. IPI is the interested party identifier, which identifies publishers and which identifies writers of musical works. On the other side, you have IPN, the International Performer Number, which is for, as it says, performers. And again, you have proprietary IDs. So let's have a quick look at some of those identifiers. ISWC, the International Standard Work Code. It's an ISO standard, 15707, and it's been in existence for a number of years now. It's just the system that runs the identifier, which is managed by CSAC, has just recently been updated. And you see a URL there where you can actually get access to that system. ISWC allocates identifiers for musical works on request, basically by a music rights society. So as soon as a music rights society learns of a new work, they request through this ISWC net an identifier for that musical work. And the system then centrally allocates one of those identifiers. But the system does more. If, for example, two societies would request an identifier for the same musical work at the same time, then it would allocate two identifiers. But the system then also can, at a later stage, archive, as they call it, one of those identifiers and make the other one the preferred ISWC. So that even if there are clashes between ISWCs, the system actually has a means to disambiguate them and to actually, or in this case, ambiguate them, to collate them into a single entity. You can go to that URL and you can search the system yourself. There's a web search interface. As things stand, there is no API where you can actually, or your computer can actually access the system on a more automated fashion today. But ISWC has started to become more and more the core identifier for the communication of musical works. And all the DDEX standards, whether it's the standards that talk about the licensing of musical works, typically done in North America, as well as the sales and usage reporting, that is all not necessarily based on the ISWC, but ISWC is certainly the preferred and best identifier for that entity. Not so much in the sales reporting, but in the other standards, you can then have things like an Opus number and a composer catalog number. That is particularly important for release deliveries. So when a record company sends stuff to a DSP for consumer consumption, because it's those consumers for whom Opus 55 of a specific composer, or in this case, Köchel 55, the composer catalog number for Mozart is important, is particularly important. These are, at least from DDEX perspective, just strings, and you have a kind of a nomenclature or general acceptance on how these are being formed, but they are for human consumption. They are typically not used in the background for processing and for automatic matching and those kind of things. That's not what they are for. Proprietary ideas, however, can very well be used for that. There is, of course, a problem with ISWC. It is being allocated comparatively late in the process of creating music. If somebody makes a composition in the studio while recording the stuff, there is no ISWC at that stage. And while CZAC is working on shortening the time from writing to allocation, there is a delay. To bridge that delay, one could use proprietary identifiers. The equivalent for the sound recording is then the International Standard Recording Code, ISO 3901, which is maintained by IFPI. And again, there is a URL there that you can find out more information about. ISRCs are not allocated centrally. So ISRC works through a network of allocating entities, if you like. These major record companies, for example, they allocate identifiers on behalf of IFPI, if you like. They are all given certain ranges of ISRCs. There's a registrant code in there, and then the record companies can allocate those identifiers. What they do is they identify performances embodied in a recording, whether that's audio or audiovisual, so music videos, for example. But very, very critically, ISRC does not say anything about ownership, for example, or rights control. It just identifies the performance. So if one record company buys a catalog of another record company, there is no need to allocate new ISRCs. In fact, there should not be new ISRCs because the sound recording hasn't changed. If, however, they put the recordings back into the studio and there is a sound engineer and they're writing the faders and just trying to change the sound of those recordings to a significant level, at that stage, yes, a new ISRC should be allocated. Also important, ISRCs does not identify releases. In the past, in DDEX messages as well, ISRCs have sometimes been used to identify what we call single sound recording releases. Those things that you typically stream, they are just single tracks, but wrapped into a commercial offering, if you like. And sometimes they were identified with ISRCs. The current DDEX standards, specifically the ERN standard, does no longer allow this because it's actually a rather bad practice. That should have those releases, even if they're just containing one sound recording, should actually have their own release identifier. And the new standards now enforce that. ISRCs, as I said, are not centrally allocated, which also means that there is not an authoritative system or database where you can get access to all of the ISRCs that have been allocated. There are databases, such as the one created by Sound Exchange in the US, for example, that cover a rather large set of those sound recordings. But as far as I know, at least, that is not a complete set. Again, IFPI is working and ensuring that that set becomes more complete as we go along. There are, of course, other identifiers for recordings, things like catalog numbers, which is basically a string and a namespace to identify the allocating party. For example, Tubular Bells was allocated by Virgin Records, and they allocated their proprietary catalog number VS 2001. And this is how that could look like in a DDEX message. By the way, the DPID in the middle there, that would be the DPID of Virgin Records. I have no idea, frankly, whether they have a DPID. I just put a made-up identifier in there. But again, it doesn't contain any dashes, so it doesn't say PA-DPID A-1234567 8-9 as the human-readable version or how this identifier would be presented if it were presented to a human. It is just the string without any special characters. And then there are other identifiers, especially for audiovisual content, ISANs, again, one of those ISO standards from the same family of standards, or an IDA can be used to identify audiovisual content. And again, proprietary IDs is something that can be used. When it comes to releases, the most common identifiers are ICPNs, barcodes, UPCs, EANs, JANs. All of those identifiers can be used, and it's common, it works, it's fine. And when it comes to the last type of entity that we're talking about is the identification of parties. And DDEX is working, for example, with the ISNI consortium that runs the ISNI standard. Again, one of those standards coming out of ISO to deal with identification of core entities in the media industries. And ISNI seems to be one of those identifiers that seems to be very, very promising in that world. It's a comparatively young identifier, and it identifies public personas. So it doesn't identify a specific person, but it identifies a public persona. Madonna, for example, is one public persona, but she also has her real name, which I have now forgotten, which is another public persona. So you would have two different ISNIs for those two public personas. It's widely used in the library and text publishing industries, and it's increasingly also used in the music industry. Most writers and also increasingly recording artists already have ISNIs. If you go to Wikipedia and look at pretty much any musician there, you will find at the very bottom you see all the different kinds of identifiers that have been allocated to that party, and you will find that most of them have been allocated ISNIs. DDEX used to communicate parties in a not very helpful way, in that we simply had names of artists, for example, in the ERN message as strings. You just said John Smith was part of this recording. This doesn't really help the DSP to actually maintain the content on their site, to be able to say, oh, this is that John Smith and this is that John Smith. They're two different musicians, and therefore we need to make sure that both of them have their own landing page or whatever the DSP would want to do. So over the last couple of years, DDEX has actually worked more and more into creating tools to better disambiguate artists and contributors so that less fuzzy matching happens. The result of that is basically that all the new DDEX messages have now something like a party list. So in the resource list, this is now the ERN message. The same applies to the radar messages. The same applies to the RIN file format. The same applies to the licensing messages that have been published earlier this year and last year as well. You have this party list, which describes the parties, and you have, for example, in the resource list where you describe the sound recording, you then simply point from the writer composite, for example, to a specific party in the party list. And when you want to point from another recording to the same party, well, you can point to the same party. Whereas if there are two John Smiths on the same recording, well, you have two different entries in that party list, and you can point to each of those separately. And each party then looks a bit like this. This is the one that's used in ERN. In the licensing, it looks slightly different, but you have a party reference. I'll talk about that in a minute. You then have identifier and name. You can have either identifiers or names or both. And then you have some additional information, in this case, an affiliation, Music Rights Society, for example, a related party, if one person is part of a band, for example, and you can even provide a artist profile page on some kind of a web service, if that's what you want to provide in the ERN context. And then the party ID, well, not surprisingly, it's all of those identifiers we talked about: ISNI, DPID, IPI name, name number, IPN, the CSAC Society ID, and as many proprietary IDs as you would like to have. One word about the DPID. The Dpeg, or the DDEX party ID, identifies a communication endpoint for a DDEX message. So sender and recipients of messages. And sometimes if people are using some kind of an aggregator service for them, those companies would also need to have a DDEX party ID. The DDEX party ID, the DPID, comes basically with a DDEX implementation license. So whenever somebody wants to implement the DDEX standards, they automatically get a DPID with it, and you can allocate them at that URL there by yourself. It comes back to you within a couple of minutes, and you have your own identifier. This is not an identifier to identify rights holders or musicians or those kind of things. It is really just for the communication endpoints for DDEX messages. I've promised you to talk a little bit about proprietary identifiers because, as I said, in the case of ISWCs, not always is there an quote official identifier, or maybe not yet. And identifiers can then fill the gap. And you see the structure of an identifier. They're just strings, and then they have a namespace that identifies the party who has allocated the identifier. It looks very much like the catalog number that I showed you for the catalog number, because the catalog number in the end is a proprietary ID. It's just a proprietary ID that we use for specific purposes. Proprietary IDs can be as globally unique as the official identifiers that I've talked about. Of course, all identifiers, there are some problems with some entities and mistakes are being made. In the end, there are humans behind those systems. But typically, all of those identification systems work quite well. And proprietary IDs can work equally well. They can be globally unique, at least as long as the allocator takes care not to reissue their own identifiers. And in the end, every company has proprietary identifiers for all the entities that they handle, because everybody has their own little database, and all the database keys, the primary keys in their databases about sound recordings, about musical works, about the talents that they're dealing with, they're proprietary identifiers. You could simply use them and communicate them to the outside world, put your own Dpeg as the namespace, and there you go, you have an identifier for it. You may not want to share those identifiers with the world, but on the other hand, you may also want to, because it may be the most straightforward thing to do. The last area that I just wanted to touch base on are those temporary identifiers within DDEX. We have in those flat file messages, such as DSR, CDM, and radar are the new standard to communicate sales or reporting revenues to music licensing, or from music licensing companies to record companies typically. Those have individual blocks of data, and then you have within those blocks, you have individual lines, records we call them, and they need to point to other records, either within the block or in a summary record, and I'll show you how that looks in a minute. And similarly, in XML standards, we have these composites that talk about other composites. The writer pointing to party composite I just referenced or referred to in a moment. So how does that look? Let's first look at the DSR. This is a DSR message. Doesn't really matter how that came to be. The colors are simply for readability. In real life, they are just tabulator separated value files. But if we're looking at those two lines, the summary line, at the top you see that the row headings, the column headings, and then below that you have the actual data. So the summary record ID of that one line is number 1. If we're looking at the SU records at the bottom, that's the sales and usage records, you have a 1 there which points basically up there. If they contain the same value, you know that that sales usage line contributes to that summary line. And in this report, there is only one summary line, so it's a little bit boring here, but that's how this works. And as I said, you can also point within a block. So here we have the sound recordings being described, and then some of the releases that are being created from those sound recordings. And you have the resource reference, which is something that you can point to. And then in the green records, you have a used resource, which is where you point from. And for example, there you see that the last of those green records points to those two sound recording records. So this REO2 release contains the 24 preludes and fugues, and it contains the symphony number 10 and the second movement thereof. Quite straightforward. And the same mechanism is used to actually map or point from one record in a CDM and a claim message to a message in a DSR, to a row in a DSR message. Quite simple, but quite powerful. Arguably more powerful because enforced by actually XML processors is the way of pointing from one place to another place in XSD. So we use the primitive ID/ID-ref mechanism where you can use any string as an anchor and then point to that anchor. That's that bit I've shown you earlier. And here is how it looks then, for example, on a contributor composite in a sound recording. So for example, you can create a party reference P100, that's the anchor for John Lennon. There's the ISNI for John Lennon, for example. And again, quite often ISNIs are presented with dashes after every fourth number. They're not needed here. Actually, they are not welcome here. ISNIs here should just be a simple string. The P100 is this anchor, but you don't need to make it just a number. You can put any kind of string in there that you would want. And then you simply point to it in a contributor composite and saying, all right, this party, P, what a brilliant musician he was he played the role of a lyricist in respect of a specific composite. The only limitation that DDEX puts on those things is that the first letter, if it's a P, it's a party. If it's a W, it's a work. If it's an R, it's a release. If it's an A, it's a resource. If it's a Q, it's for a Q sheet, and so forth. So there are those kind of identifiers, local identifiers within one message. And in the next message that you would send, this P100 or P, what a brilliant musician he was, does not need to be the same. It could be a completely different identifier in the next message, or anchor rather. The ISNI would of course be the same, but those local identifiers are only valid within that one file. The last bit, or the last slide that I wanted to share, is one example of where DDEX actually starts to create identifiers themselves. There is a need to identify places where music is made. And by actual coincidence, the film industry has a need to identify places where films are made. And it doesn't make sense to have two different identification systems running in parallel. So we're working with IDA. The people run the IDA system, which identifies items in the film value chain, film and TV value chain. So we're working together with them to identify basically a location identifier system, where you can identify places where people have written songs, where people have recorded songs, potentially also where they have been playing music. So the pyramid stage at the Glastonbury Music Festival would, for example, get their own location identifier. So would the Abbey Road Studios, so would Abbey Road Studio B, and so forth. We have agreed our technical requirements. They still need harmonizing with IDAS because we've basically just started this process. And then we need to start discussions about governance and finances and all of those fun subjects. Governance on those identifiers is always a crucial bit because that goes back to the reliability of the identifiers. If there is no strict rules about who can allocate identifiers, we will end up with duplicate identifiers for Abbey Road Studio B. And that is, or even worse, having one identifier which identifies two different places. That must not be. Therefore, there needs to be some kind of governance rules put on top of the technical build, and those discussions will need to start fairly soon to get this going. Thank you for being here and for staying with me, and I hope you found this helpful. Thank you very much, everybody. Bye-bye.